August 20th, 1945. Ypres Harbor, Guam. The transport ship's engines coughed to life as nearly 300 Japanese women stepped onto the gangway. Their khaki uniforms bleached by sun and salt, their faces carved hollow by years of rationed hope. Nurses who had cradled dying men in field hospitals across the Pacific. Radio operators who had transmitted the Empire's final desperate lies. Students barely 18, conscripted into a war machine that had promised them divine victory and delivered only ash and silence. They moved without speaking, surrounded by American guards whose very existence contradicted everything Tokyo had taught them to believe. Before we journey deeper into this moment that shattered an empire's carefully constructed reality, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, whether you're in Manila, Munich, Montreal, or somewhere between. This is a story about the day 300 women discovered that everything they'd been willing to die for was built on lies, and it deserves to be remembered. The women boarded slowly, stealing glances at the American sailors moving cargo along the dock. These weren't the stooped, malnourished weaklings from the propaganda posters plastered across every Tokyo street corner. These men stood tall, shoulders broad beneath clean uniforms, moving crates with casual strength that seemed almost performative in its ease. One nurse, Yuki Tanaka, 24 years old, 5 years trained in military medicine, pressed her journal against her chest and felt a question forming that she dared not speak aloud. If everything they told us about American weakness was a lie, she would write that night, "What else have they hidden from us?" The realization hadn't fully crystallized yet, hadn't yet become the earthquake that would demolish the foundations of her world. But as the ship pulled away from Guam's bomb-cratered shores, heading east toward the American mainland, 300 women began a 10-day journey that would prove more devastating than any battlefield defeat. They thought they were traveling toward imprisonment, toward punishment, perhaps toward execution. They didn't know they were sailing straight toward the truth itself, and that the truth would be more brutal than any weapon America had deployed against them. To understand the shock that awaited them, you need to understand the manufactured reality they'd inhabited since childhood. Since the early 1930s, Japanese citizens had been fed a meticulously constructed narrative through every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every classroom lecture, every government bulletin. America was portrayed as a mongrel nation, its strength diluted by racial mixing and capitalist decadence, its people made lazy by luxury, its men softened by comfort, its women vulgar and immoral. The Empire's propagandists had painted vivid pictures of American cities crumbling into ruin, factories falling silent, red lines stretching for miles through streets where unemployed workers fought for scraps. These weren't random fabrications or casual exaggerations. They were calculated psychological weapons precision-engineered to make sacrifice acceptable, to make starvation bearable, to make death meaningful. If your enemy was already dying, then your own deprivation had purpose. If their soldiers were racially inferior and morally weak, then your brother's death on some godforsaken island carried weight. If their nation was collapsing from within, then perhaps the kamikaze pilot's final dive could tip the balance toward victory. The Ministry of Information had controlled every image, every statistic, every whisper that reached the Japanese public. By 1945, most civilians genuinely believed America was on the verge of collapse, that one more push, one more sacrifice, One more year of endurance would bring the inevitable triumph. The women boarding that transport ship carried this manufactured worldview in their bones, in their blood, in the very rhythm of their thoughts. Sachiko Yamamoto, 22 years old, trained as a nurse in Hiroshima before the war consumed everything, had spent 3 years treating wounded soldiers in field hospitals from Saipan to Okinawa. She'd watched boys her own age die with the emperor's name on their lips, whispering banzai with their last breath, believing absolutely that their sacrifice would save the homeland from barbarian invasion. She'd gone weeks eating nothing but watery rice gruel and dried fish so old it had turned gray, told repeatedly that American soldiers were starving even worse, that their supply lines were broken, that their nation couldn't feed its own armies. When her commanding officer surrendered in mid-August, after the sky had turned to fire twice in ways no one could explain, Sachiko assumed the Americans would execute them all. That's what happened to prisoners of war. Everyone knew this. The Americans were barbaric that way, cruel in victory, merciless toward the defeated. But the first crack in her reality appeared before the ship even departed Guam. An American medic, a woman with golden hair pulled back in a neat bun, and a crisp white uniform that seemed to glow in the tropical sun, examined the Japanese prisoners for infectious diseases before transport. She worked quickly and efficiently, her movements practiced and professional, but without cruelty, without the savage pleasure Sachiko had been taught to expect. When Sachiko flinched during the examination, anticipating pain or humiliation, the American medic smiled and said something in English, her tone gentle, almost maternal. An interpreter, a Japanese-American woman in U.S. Army uniform, translated quietly. "She says you're safe now. No one is going to hurt you." Sachiko didn't believe it, couldn't allow herself to believe it. Kindness from the enemy was just another form of psychological torture, surely designed to break resistance, to extract information, to humiliate the defeated. But when the examination ended and the American medic offered her a piece of candy, real sugar wrapped in bright paper printed with English words, something shifted in Sachiko's understanding. The woman's hands were steady and sure, her fingernails clean and trimmed, her skin healthy and unmarked by the sores that came from vitamin deficiency. These weren't the hands of someone whose nation was starving, whose people were collapsing from deprivation. The ship departed at dawn, slipping out of Apra Harbor as the sun turned the Pacific gold and crimson. For the first few hours the women sat in near total silence in the cargo hold, which had been converted into temporary quarters with metal bunks and wool blankets. They expected deprivation. They expected punishment for having served the emperor, for having been part of the war machine, even in supporting roles. What they received instead was lunch, and lunch changed everything. American sailors carried in metal trays, dozens of them, loaded with food that seemed to belong to a different universe than the one they'd inhabited for the past 4 years. White bread, impossibly soft and fresh, the kind of pure wheat flour bread that had vanished from Japan by 1942. Canned peaches swimming in heavy syrup so sweet it seemed obscene. Beef stew with actual chunks of meat visible in the thick brown gravy, not the watered-down broth with occasional fish scraps they'd survived on. Real butter in individual portions, golden and rich. Coffee that smelled dark and complex, not the burned grain substitute they'd been calling coffee since 1943. And the portions, Dear God, the portions were staggering. More food on a single tray than most of them had seen in a week, maybe 2 weeks, back home. At first, no one moved to eat. 300 women stared at the trays like they might contain poison or explosives, like this abundance was itself a weapon designed to break them. Then one woman, Kimiko Sato, a radio operator who transmitted coded messages from a bunker on Tinian until the island fell, picked up a piece of white bread with trembling fingers. She tore it slowly, examining the texture, bringing it to her nose to smell the yeast and wheat. White bread, pure white flour with no sawdust mixed in, no rice husks, no bark powder, none of the adulterants that had stretched Japan's grain supplies as the war ground on. She took one small bite, chewed carefully, her eyes widening as the taste registered. Then she took another bite, faster now, and another, eating with increasing desperation, tears streaming down her hollow cheeks. That broke the dam of hesitation and self-control. 300 women fell upon the food with an urgency that transcended hunger. That spoke to years of systematic starvation disguised as patriotic sacrifice. They ate like women who'd forgotten what fullness felt like, whose bodies had been consuming themselves for so long that the sudden influx of real nutrition felt almost painful. And as they ate, as the sugar hit bloodstreams depleted to dangerous levels, and the protein began the slow work of rebuilding wasted muscle tissue, a terrible question formed in 300 minds simultaneously, whispered in the silence between bites. If the Americans have this much food to give to prisoners, to enemies, to women who served against them, how much do they have for themselves? How much surplus exists in a nation that can afford to feed its captives like this? The implications were staggering, universe-altering, foundation-shattering. The meals continued with relentless, devastating consistency. 3 times a day, every single day for 10 days straight. Breakfast brought scrambled eggs, real eggs from actual chickens, served with toast and jam so sweet it made their teeth ache. Lunch varied between thick sandwiches, layered with meat and cheese, or soups so rich with vegetables and protein they seemed criminally wasteful. Dinner always included a main protein, beef or chicken or fish, alongside vegetables that weren't withered or rotten, bread that was fresh baked that morning, and dessert. There was always dessert. Cookies and cake and pudding and fruit cocktail swimming in syrup so abundant it had to be poured off before eating. On the 3rd day, Sachiko stood near the galley entrance, watching the aftermath of the sailors' lunch service. An American sailor, young and healthy and impossibly well-fed, scraped half-eaten food from his plate directly into a garbage bin. She watched him do it without thought, without hesitation, without any sense that what he was discarding had value. That discarded food, tossed away like it meant nothing, would have fed her entire family for 2 days, maybe 3, if stretched carefully. She thought of her mother's hands perpetually trembling from malnutrition and vitamin deficiency, the skin cracked and bleeding no matter how carefully she tried to protect them. She thought of her little brother, 8 years old, but standing barely 4 feet tall, his growth permanently stunted by chronic childhood hunger. She thought of her father, a factory worker who'd given his rice portions to his children week after week until he became too weak to work, too depleted to stand for a full shift. And here, on this American ship, the enemy threw food into the ocean, like it carried no value at all, like the abundance was so overwhelming that waste was inevitable. Kimiko had a parallel revelation that same afternoon. She'd spent 18 months in a concrete bunker on Tinian, broadcasting false victory reports, reading scripts prepared by officers about American defeats that never happened, American losses that existed only in Tokyo's desperate imagination. She'd known they were lies. Every radio operator knew the truth, could read between the lines of the orders they transmitted. But she'd believed the underlying narrative, the core assumption that made the lies seem necessary and temporary. America was stretched thin, struggling to supply its far-flung forces, rationing everything, barely holding its economy together under the strain of global war. That's why the propaganda was necessary, to maintain morale during the final push toward an inevitable victory that was just one more sacrifice away. But on the fifth day, watching through a porthole, she saw the ship's cook dump an entire pot of rice overboard because it had cooked too long and turned slightly mushy. An entire pot, enough rice to feed a platoon for a day, just dumped into the Pacific like garbage, like refuse, like nothing. She found an interpreter, cornered her near the cargo hold entrance. "Why are you wasting food like this?" Kimiko demanded, her English broken but furious. "Is this a trick? A deliberate attempt to demoralize us? To show us your wealth?" The interpreter, the same Japanese-American woman who'd translated for the medic, looked genuinely confused by the question. "Wasting?" she repeated carefully. "Honey, the galley cooks fresh meals 3 times every day. They have to dispose of leftovers. There's nowhere to store it all, and serving day-old food would violate Navy regulations." Kimiko felt reality tilt beneath her feet. "But what about rationing? Surely you're rationing supplies?" The interpreter's confusion deepened into something like concern. "Rationing? America hasn't rationed food since 1943, and even that was voluntary. Some sugar, some butter, nothing serious. Certainly nothing like—" She gestured at Kimiko's hollow cheeks, her protruding collarbones, the visible shape of her skull beneath skin, stretched too tight. No rationing. Food so abundant that regulations prevented its reuse. Surplus so overwhelming that fresh cooking 3 times daily was standard procedure. Kimiko had spent 18 months broadcasting increasingly frantic stories about American starvation, American desperation, American supply failures, American defeats. All lies, every single word. But worse than that, the lies had been built on a foundational misunderstanding of reality, so profound that even the truth-tellers hadn't grasped it. That night in the hold, as the ship cut through dark Pacific waters, whispered conversations began spreading through the bunks. Hesitant at first, voices barely audible above the engine's steady rumble, then growing bolder as more women contributed their observations. "Did you see the guards' boots today? Brand new leather, not a scuff on them. These blankets they gave us are real wool, pure wool. When did any of us last touch real wool? The medic who checked my throat infection had actual medicine, real penicillin, not that military-issue substitute that barely works. The real drug." One woman, a university student named Hana Ishikawa, who'd been conscripted directly from her mathematics program, finally said what they were all thinking, what none of them had dared speak aloud. Everything was a lie. Everything they told us about America, about the war, about why we were starving. All of it. Lies. The response wasn't immediate agreement. Not yet. The manufactured reality they'd lived inside for years didn't collapse all at once. "Shut your mouth," someone hissed from a nearby bunk. You'll get us all punished for defeatist talk. But the seed was planted in 300 minds, and with every meal, every glimpse of casual American abundance, every small revelation about the vast gulf between what they'd been told and what was true, that seed germinated and grew. On the 7th day, the California coastline materialized through morning fog. The women were allowed on deck in small groups for exercise and fresh air. Sachiko stood at the railing, gripping the cold metal hard enough to hurt, watching the shoreline emerge like a developing photograph. Then San Francisco appeared through the mist, and the manufactured world ended completely. Skyscrapers, dozens of them, steel and glass towers stabbing upward into low clouds. Buildings taller than anything in Tokyo, except the Imperial Palace grounds. The Golden Gate Bridge, impossibly massive, painted bright international orange, carrying what looked like hundreds of vehicles across the bay in both directions simultaneously. Docks swarming with activity despite the early hour. Massive cranes loading and unloading cargo ships. Warehouses the size of city blocks lining the waterfront. Cargo moving in organized chaos. Everything flowing, everything functional, everything intact. Beyond the immediate waterfront, the city itself spread across hills in layers, buildings stacked on steep slopes, streets laid out in geometric precision, electric lights winking on as morning gave way to full day. This was supposed to be a dying nation. This was supposed to be defeat, collapse, imminent failure. This was supposed to be a country on its knees, barely holding itself together. Hana Ishikawa stood beside Sachiko at the railing, gripping the metal so tightly her knuckles went bone white. "It's not real," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It's a stage set, some kind of elaborate theater. It has to be. But stage sets don't smell like diesel fuel and salt air and morning coffee from nearby diners. Stage sets don't hum with electrical power running through underground cables. Stage sets don't stretch to every horizon in every direction, solid and real and utterly, devastatingly intact." An American sailor walked past them, hands in his pockets, whistling a tune Sachiko didn't recognize. He glanced at the Japanese women clustered at the railing, nodded politely in greeting, and kept walking. Just another morning in San Francisco. Just another ship arriving in port. To him, all of this was completely ordinary. The city, the abundance, the infrastructure, the power, all of it was simply Tuesday. Sachiko turned from the railing, unable to reconcile belief with reality. America, seen first from a ship and then from a train, dismantled everything Japanese propaganda had promised. Passenger cars with cushioned seats carried them inland through endless farmland. Mechanized harvesters, overflowing silos in towns where children were tall, clean, and well-fed. At a Nebraska stop, an American girl tossed away a half-eaten apple. The waste struck harder than abundance. It meant food had lost value because there was always more. Steel mills in Indiana burned through the night, producing endlessly. The women understood the numbers without being shown them. This was not defeat, it was impossibility. Japan had never stood a chance. At Camp McCoy they found hot showers, soap, doctors, and careful medical care that revealed how starved they truly were. American physicians spoke of critical malnutrition as if describing a disaster zone. Anger followed clarity. Not at America, but at Tokyo. Leaders had known the industrial gap and sent people to die anyway. When lectures finally presented production figures, no one argued. The war had been mathematics disguised as destiny. They returned to Japan carrying truth, knowing the defeat.